Thank you all for joining us. I'm Cheretta Clerkley, the Chief Operations Officer at the International Society for Technology and Education, known to many in the education community as ITSE. As you all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has tested our K-12 education system, challenging educators, parents, and students in unprecedented ways. The digital divide has been a frequent topic of conversation over the past few years, especially as our classrooms and schools were required to quickly transition from in-person to virtual learning. Although great progress has been made to close the gap, there's still much work that needs to be done. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you all about connectivity and digital access. Just a few steps that we need to close the digital divide to ensure that digital equity means that we're also working together. I'd like to invite the panel to start off by sharing the levers of change through which your organization has addressed this issue. Particularly, let's focus on where the bright spots are across the nation. I'd like to open it up to everyone at this point.
Okay, I can jump in. Good morning. I'm Kathryn DeWitt. I'm the project director for the Broadband Access Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trusts. For those of you who aren't familiar with Pew, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institution. The job for me and everybody else inside the walls there is to provide policymakers at every level of government with analysis and research to help solve really complex policy problems. And there are a few that I would argue are more complex than the digital divide. And so when we're talking about levers to ensure not only that every American has access to an affordable and reliable high-speed internet connection, but not only has the skills to use it, you really are looking at a couple of key channels of work, one of which is research. We need, shocker that the one who works for a research organization is going to say that more research is needed, but we do need more research in this field. We need an evidence base that documents need, that documents effective practices, that also evaluates programs as well. We need direct support for practitioners, for the states, for the local leaders, the ones who are implementing the programs that are being rolled out right now. And then the third area of work is really around advocacy, policy change, and coalition building. How are we creating the space for folks to come around policy solutions, to demonstrate what's needed, and to work with their lawmakers and other agents of change in order to ensure that we aren't just implementing solutions that are short-term, but we're really looking at the long-term.
Hi, thanks so much for having us today and talking about such an important topic. I'm Angie Cooper with Heartland Forward. Heartland Forward is a policy think and do tank focused on really how do we help change the narrative about the middle of the country and kickstart economic growth. So we do focus on those states in the middle of the country as a public 501c3. Think everything from North Dakota down to Texas, over to Alabama, up to Michigan and Ohio, and all the states in between. I think one specific topic that we talk a lot about as a think and do tank is that if we don't have access to high-speed internet across not just the heartland, but our country, it's going to be very challenging to continue to kickstart that economic development, because we know that not having access to the internet impacts the way you search for a job, train for a job, do a job. It impacts the way you receive your healthcare and the technologies that go around that. COVID obviously shined a light on the education challenges, but our children are going to continue to work in the classroom and at home. And so how do we ensure that they're connected? And then, like I said, it's the overall regional competitiveness of our residents, our families, and our communities. What's also really important is, and we'll get into these discussions today, when I say I work for Heartland Forward, a lot of people say, oh, you're focused on rural America. Those 20 states that we identify as the Heartland is actually the third largest economy under the US and China. And so we have to take this specific issue. This isn't an urban versus rural. There's some of the exact same challenges that exist in urban communities and rural. And we talk a lot about convening, and the magic happens when you bring the right people around the table. And so a lot of the work that we're doing in partnership with national organizations like Pew and others, but we're doing a lot of work on the ground. And we can't overcomplicate really getting results and helping these states and local communities spend the federal dollars that are out there. Good news is there's a lot of money, but now how do we get people convened and sort of working towards the same goal? So we talk a lot about not only is it we have to have the infrastructure, but people have to be able to afford what is the technology and the infrastructure that's in the ground. So what are the tools and resources that go along with that? Along with adoptability, what is the digital literacy? That is also an urban and a rural issue, that it's not unique versus one state or the other. And so how do we keep moving those types of conversations forward to ensure that we're not looking at in 3 to 5 years a whole new complete different digital divide? So looking forward to the conversation, digging in a little bit deeper about some of the opportunities and challenges that still exist, because this isn't a one size fits all approach. It really is. We got to look and understand our states and communities to help ensure that they're accelerating their dollars and spending them in the right way to advance their communities.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and jump in. Dr. Jeff Carlson with T-Mobile's education team. I guess I'd highlight 3 different bright spots that we've seen, particularly over the last few years. For us as a network that lives in the sky and not in the ground, I think one bright spot we've seen is that connectivity can't be connected to an address. So we're going to talk probably a lot about broadband maps. You'll see states and regions continuing to try to locate where broadband is available. But most folks who are joining us today have connectivity in their pocket. They may have it on their watch. They have probably multiple devices that are connected to the internet that follow them around and are not tied to an address. We saw at the beginning of COVID, when we were all stuck in our homes, that actually all you really needed was to have it at your address, if you were lucky enough to have that. But as we emerge from and continue to adapt to COVID, I think connectivity that follows you and that follows students and educators is going to be something that we continue to see. And we saw a big movement toward that over the course of the pandemic. The second thing I would say that's tied to that is, despite some supply chain issues that we continue to see, the greater availability and a more approachable price point for connected devices, particularly for students. So we saw the availability of both kind of tablets, Chromebooks, connected laptops, things like that, where you open it up, hit the power button, and you're connected right away, and not trying to find whether it's a fast food restaurant or a coffee shop or your aunt's house or your mom's workplace. You had connectivity that was right there with you because it was embedded in the device. And then the third bright spot that I guess we see from a T-Mobile perspective is thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of educators, school systems, and libraries across the country that stepped up to provide connectivity not just to students over the course of the pandemic, but actually entire communities. Most of the federal funding that we saw, at least from a T-Mobile perspective, that was dedicated to connectivity, powered entire households, not just so that students could learn during the day, but so that their families could access telehealth, telebanking, lots of things that they may not have been able to even access before prior to COVID. But we saw this all kind of come together through schools. In many communities, that was the one kind of community building that was open the whole time. In most communities, schools actually were open for at least some students, maybe on a and B schedule. And so we actually delivered devices to schools and saw them distributed across communities. So just a big shout out to the educators, IT directors, and then librarians and library systems that made that happen.
Yeah, one thing that we saw from ITSE standpoint is during the pandemic, there was all this access to technology, but teachers really wanted to focus on how they could engage their students and knowing how to use the tools efficiently and effectively. And that's something that we're continuing to see, even as we're still kind of going through the pandemic, is people really investing in their professional development to ensure that not only do we have access to these tools, but students actually know how to use them the correct way. So instead of all of the don'ts, you shouldn't do this online, you shouldn't do that, really trying to reinforce what it is that we should be doing a little bit and talk a little bit to the point where a lot of people would say the door has closed on this issue or that it has been resolved? And what would be your response to that?
Ooh. Angie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I would say absolutely that is not true. I mean, you walk into any local community, like I said, large, small, everyone is impacted by not having the high-speed internet access that actually is required for us to continue to drive schools, to drive workforce, to continue to advance our community. So there is a lot of work still to be done. And one of the things that we focus a lot on, as I said, sort of on the ground work, how do we support communities? There's billions of dollars that are going to be flowing into our states and communities over the next, multiple years to come. And as we look at the broader infrastructure opportunities, the affordability, digital skills, the digital equity programs that need to be implemented, a local mayor in the Heartland, most likely, and I'm a daughter of a mayor from the Heartland when I was growing up, I mean, it's a part-time job in most cases, and they're, as a mayor, they're just trying to focus on keeping the lights on, the trash picked up. My dad used to say I'm a water, sewer, trash guy. And because there's so much that's like right here that is needed, that there needs to be partners and organizations like all of us that are talking today, that all of those that are listening today, that how do we help support our local officials? Because they just truly don't have the capacity. So one thing that we're really proud of at Heartland Forward is we have partnered with an organization called Benton Institute. And we're working right now in Ohio, Illinois, and Arkansas, and what we call our Accelerate program. And we're actually taking communities through, they do about a 14-week program of how do they build their plan. How do they plan to use those infrastructure dollars? And, the first thing that we ask them is, who's your team? Who are the 12 to 15 people around that need to help you build your plan? That's education, that's industry, that's, like I said, nonprofits. And so I know I was just on a call with the group that launched in Arkansas last week, and they very much, some of them, the mayor couldn't get connected to the call. So that's a real, that's just, a real need. So I guarantee you when you're on the ground, people are not saying that we're saying we're just actually getting started.
Yep. In case you can't tell from my bobbleheading along with Angie, as I usually do, I completely agree. The work truly is just beginning, which feels kind of crazy because I feel like there's been a lot of ramp up to get to where we are. And, Cheretta, you asked earlier, what are some of the bright spots about where the field is right now? And I think that one of them is what we're getting ready to do, which is the field has, and to Dr. Carlson's point earlier as well, the field's understanding, and I think the public's understanding of how we use the internet and its value, its utility to households, I think really did rapidly change during COVID. And as a result, policy is now reflecting that. And so we are getting ready to enter a stage of implementation where states will be working very closely with local leaders, elected officials, local governments, and then stakeholders of all types, schools, educators, libraries, employers, you name it, they need to be at the table to collect information about what does the state of connectivity look like. Talk to us about that. What does price demand and elasticity of demand look like in your communities? What do you want your community to have in the future? What are we building towards? What is your goal for economic opportunity? And what is your goal for education and telehealth? How are you, if you're talking to educators, how do you want to make sure that they are able to access the latest in technology innovations and applying them to the classrooms? Those are the types of conversations that in some cases state broadband programs have actually been doing and leading for several years. That's why we're seeing this reflected in federal policy now. But states are getting ready to implement this phase of this phase of the federal funding requirements. And that's a really exciting moment because it acknowledges that, it's not really about the technology. It is about what opportunities that technology offers to the community. And now the community and all those other areas that technology impacts, they have to have a seat at the table and input in that planning process. So I think that's a really exciting bright spot that we want to see, but that also reinforces the point that the door has not been closed. That door is blown wide open, and we want everybody at the table, including funders, to help with that community engagement, to help getting all those partners to the table and make sure that those perspectives are all represented. So all hands on deck moment. No, you have not missed the boat. Like, come on in, call us if you need help figuring out how to jump in and get engaged.
Yeah, and just to back up on what Angie and Kathryn said from a kind of the industry perspective, two additional points. The first is that I think I'm a little bit worried that we're going to build the system that we need today or that we needed 2 years ago and not think about the system of connectivity that we'll need for the future, right? So are we building for a Zoom conversation, or are we building for kind of Web 3.0, whether you call it the metaverse or whatever term you want to use for immersive technology? That is going to happen quicker than any of us realize. And we're going to need to start that system building now. And a lot of the conversations I'm in are about how we make sure that we have, the ability to do email and a Zoom conversation at the same time. And that's not how people are going to work. That's not how students are going to learn going forward. And so I think that we have a lot of work to do to focus on future needs and not the needs for today. So even if the door is open, it's not cracked all the way open yet. It's we still got to push it the rest of the way. And then the second thing I think I would say is that we've got a lot of exhausted people, and we're about to have a lot of exhausted funds. So we work mostly with IT directors in school systems. And if you have ever worked in a school system, you know that your IT director many times is the person who is best at technology in the school building, particularly if you're from a small rural district like where I grew up. And that person has had to take on, tracking devices, ordering different types of things, making sure things are coming back in from schools and households in different places. And that is not the job that we were ever training them to do. It's not the job they've ever been asked to do or paid to do. And so we see a lot of folks kind of going, is that really what the future of that role is? Is it going to be held within schools, or kind of to Kathryn's point, as regions and communities figure this out, who is going to have that job? Angie's dad probably wasn't going to be able to do it as a mayor in a part-time role. My dad, when he was a rural superintendent, wasn't going to be able to figure that out either. And so I think we have to figure out who does that work, because right now they're all tired. And the second thing is the money's about to be gone. So even if we were able to provide access during a large period of federal stimulus, school systems, library systems, communities are figuring out that they've even if they haven't spent it all yet, they know where it's going to go. And whether that's ESSER funds in schools, or what we've done a lot of work through is the FCC's Emergency Connectivity Fund, that money will run out, and I'm afraid that we are going to treat the connectivity closure that we've seen as an era that happened during the pandemic, and not something that we transition to when we still need it, but there may not be kind of the federal influx of funds to make that happen.
I think Dr. Carlson led to the perfect segue to talk about a lot of the work that Kathryn's team is doing to mobilize a coalition that will work together to provide affordable high-speed internet to all communities across the country. And so what I'd like to know from you, Kathryn, is what have you identified as the moonshot of this initiative?
Yeah, I think pulling together a coalition at any point is always a fascinating process. And it is there are a lot of broadband related coalitions out there. Like, just Google it and search it and many will pop up. And what we found really, why we established this one, it's called Opportunity Broadband, because what we realized through the course of our own work in working with states and working with national lawmakers and researchers and other partners, specifically in the broadband and digital equity community, which has always been a fairly small community of practitioners, of experts, we realized there really wasn't an organization or an entity that was creating space for folks who were new to this issue, who were coming in and raising their hand because of COVID, or even organizations like Heartland Forward that had actually been doing work on broadband before the pandemic, but then really accelerated their efforts because of the pandemic. But there really wasn't a space for them to say, you know, I'm not an internet service provider. I'm not a digital equity focused organization. I don't provide, you know, basic digital literacy training. I don't really know what my space is here, but I know that I have a role here because I work in healthcare delivery, or I am an education organization, or I focus on the, you know, keeping small businesses in rural communities. I don't really know where I fit into this ecosystem. And so that's where Opportunity Broadband came from. This is about creating sort of this tent for all of the organizations who really do benefit from universal high-speed access from a digitally literate labor force, and kind of helping them understand, one, you know, what is happening in the space, because to Jeff's point, there's a lot going on just in federal broadband policy alone. But kind of explaining all of this to them, but then also helping to clarify, what's your role here? Where can you contribute? How can you be a partner to the implementation that's happening on the ground? How can you be a partner in advocacy efforts and communications? And what we found through, that's what we found through this scoping process, was really that folks were eager to, one, have a space where they could learn about what opportunities were happening within broadband, so they could educate their own members who are doctors and educators and experts and researchers of their own. So the storytelling and the communications aspect is really important. They also want to elevate their own stories of how lack of broadband access has impacted their communities. You know, why does it matter to someone who has a spinal disorder, and why and how that lack of broadband access has affected their life? They want to be able to have a space to elevate those stories. There's also a more demand for research. I mentioned this earlier. It's not just with respect to programs and measuring the impact of programs. It's also understanding, what do we know and what do we and don't we know about tech-enabled applications? How are we going to ensure that some of the progress that was made during COVID, whether it's about access to virtual care or certifications for educators, what needs to stay? How do we, what's been effective, and what steps need to be taken either through policy or other measures to ensure that those effective tools and steps are institutionalized in some form or another. And then that really builds into the policy piece of what policy changes are also required. Is this really about focusing on universal access and really looking at sort of the complementary technologies, which I think Jeff has been talking a little bit about, our home access and then also mobile access? Is it also pushing more on affordability, or do we really need to be helping lawmakers understand what the digital economy actually means? Nobody knows what it actually means. We talk about it a lot, but everybody has this very vague sense of what it means. How do we really ground that for lawmakers so they can understand why this investment that we are making, this $65 billion, that's with a B, $65 billion investment in a single bill, it's helping them understand the impact that it's going to have on the constituents and the communities that they serve. So really, sorry, I'll sum it up here. When we're talking about the need for this coalition, and we really created it to create an inclusive space to help these new stakeholders understand what role they can play in helping achieve digital equity. And it's helping them do that through communications, through research, and through policy change.
Angie, I think there's so much interconnectivity between the work that you and Kathryn are doing. And I also think that there's a lot of misconceptions about rural communities in general. Can you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing with the Heartland organization, particularly as it relates to untapped talent for the American economy and what impact that has on all of us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, how Kathryn explained the creation of Opportunity Broadband, we're proud to be a partner in that and have worked closely with Kathryn over the course of, you know, the past year and a half. What we're lucky to have in our communities right now today is a lot of people want to take action. A lot of people want to help. And so how do we ensure that we aren't recreating, best practices, and how do we drive for change? So a few of the things that we're doing specifically, and maybe what some would technically call more rural heartland communities, is affordability is key. So we have worked alongside the FCC through the Affordable Connectivity Program, formerly the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, and just getting information out to those communities about who is eligible and how do you sign up. I've told this story, and Kathryn's heard it now many of times, but the great work and the fact that there are dollars out there, and Jeff, you said it, like the dollars will eventually run out. So how do we ensure that it gets in the hands of the right people? But then we also create policy that, we know 20 some companies stood up with the president and said $30 is the low cost, which aligns with the subsidy from the FCC. But how do we ensure that stays in place for residents? But when all of this was rolling out initially, for those households that needed it most to receive $30 for service and a one-time fee to purchase a device in the home, it was all being rolled out online. And we were like, well, I think we should do this differently because the people we're trying to touch aren't online. Thankfully, the FCC has created, through some of the funding that will come down, ways in which you can market and educate to these communities. But we did just really simple things at Heartland Forward and some of our rural communities. We trained over 500 librarians, because libraries are still a central network in these communities. It's not just a central network, but we haven't talked yet about the word trust in these communities. A lot of people, in smaller communities are like, what do you mean free money? Like, do I trust this? What does this mean? It seems confusing, so we trained librarians, we worked with local organizations, we put up billboards, we ran radio ads. We worked in partnership with LULAC and Latino communities to be able to provide education, sort of that real hands-on support. And we're seeing it make a difference. It is impacting the numbers. It's impacting more people getting connected and being able to use that $30. But I can't stress enough, that needs to continue. Our providers need to stay in the game. And that means all providers. We're seeing a lot of ISPs in these local communities, because in small rural communities, it's all about that last mile. So how do we do that? And then we also have a program in partnership with an organization called Lead for America. And we have young students that recently graduated from school coming back to their hometowns to help solve the digital divide. Some of our fellows are working in, for instance, the mayor of Little Rock's office in Arkansas. Others are working with local community organizations in Ohio and Illinois. But they're doing the on-the-ground work of saying, okay, you know what, we need on the adoptability, digital literacy, and we talked a bit about it through the education system. We're going to create training for teachers in our community so they can prepare the class, they understand how to use that technology, because to Jeff's point, it's not enough just one person being the technology director. Like, we all got to be the technology director. So we're doing a lot of creative things in the space, and it's paying off for those smaller communities. That, do we trust these organizations that are coming in to help us? How do we engage? How does it make sense for my specific community?
Can I add one quick thing to Angie's point here about the role of internet service providers? And I think where they have been so helpful, and I think maybe they haven't gotten enough credit for being helpful in this during the pandemic, is really, I think, elevating the need for these affordable offers, and also for sharing their own learnings about how to improve the outcomes from these programs. I mean, our field's understanding of how to improve you can call them take rates, it's subscription rates for low-income offers really comes from research from internet service providers. Our understanding of that, what Angie was just talking about the importance of trust and working with trusted community partners, that's based on research performed by the ISPs very early in the implementation of those low-income programs. So it's really important, as we, to Angie's point, like all when we talk about everybody in the field, we also mean the internet service providers, because they are the ones who, by and large, are the ones, the for-profit companies that are providing connections throughout the country. And these are companies of all sizes. And I'm not just saying this, Jeff, because you're on the phone. No, I'm joking. I'm totally joking. But the when we talk about everybody having a seat at the table, that includes the internet service providers, because they are the ones providing the connections to the internet, and we need them to be partners in that process in cementing policy change and helping us understand what are going to be the correct prices, what are going to be the appropriate policy interventions that are going to make sure that in some cases, you know, for some of these companies, it's a very slim profit margin. So there are a lot of things that we have to take into consideration when we're crafting these solutions. But I think that the internet service providers have offered a lot of learnings to help us evolve our understanding of what's needed and how to help customers actually get online when those networks are available.
You know, I think that those are all great points. And I think it leads to another question that I'm sure our audience is going to want to know. You know, with the pandemic, all of us had to shift, right? And we had to come up with new ways to be able to reach our audiences. And Dr. Carlson, I know you had a colleague that attended RISE 2021 last year and gave an update on Project 10 Million. Can you tell us how that project's going and if any pivots needed to occur to be able to reach the audiences that you needed to?
Yeah, so Mike Katz on our team joined last year and talked a little bit about Project 10 Million, but in case you don't know what that is, when T-Mobile and Sprint merged, literally the month that the pandemic was announced in 2020, part of that commitment was what we called Project 10 Million. And that is a commitment to provide up to 2 million households a year for 5 years, hence 10 million, access to a free hotspot device and up to 100 megabytes of internet access a year for 5 years from when they start. So if you join in the first year, you got 5 years from there. If you join in the last year, you get 5 years from there. That's focused on students and one per household. Through kind of negotiation with the FCC, figured out how we wanted to reach kind of the most folks. And so, you know, talk about pivot. So we announced that project, and then the next month, many schools closed down and kids were stuck at home. And so immediately we moved from, you know, a couple of years ago having 30,000 or so lines of connectivity in K-12 schools to now over or about 4 million lines of connectivity with K-12 school systems. So just a little bit of growth there. To Kathryn's point, I think T-Mobile is still learning what it means to be so heavily involved in figuring out how to work with schools and understanding even the selling cycles, which were completely disrupted by the pandemic. How can we meet schools where they are? Who do we need to speak to? How do we educate school board members even about how to make those decisions? Because back to the IT director, you know, school boards make a lot of decisions about what's happening in these communities. And how do you understand, do we go with a local provider? Do we go with somebody that has a network? Do we go with fiber? And many of those folks were not elected to a position where it comes with a lot of training on understanding the differences between those things. So we've got about, 3 million hotspots out to students, another million or so connected devices. And it was also interesting to see we stepped up where we saw what we called the homework gap. We were trying to close the homework gap, and now we've been trying to close how to help students get connectivity from kind of school bell ringing at the beginning of the day to the end of the day. So we ended up working with a lot of schools to actually expand that 100 gigabytes a year to add on connectivity so that students could be connected throughout the day when they needed to be. We've just started the third year of Project 10 Million. And so we've got a mix of folks that have worked with school districts. So we can work with a school district to provide that connectivity to students who are in low-income families, or a family can walk into any T-Mobile store across the country and provide some documentation and be able to receive a hotspot and join the program that way. And we're starting now to see that happen more and more. Surprisingly not, when all of our stores were closed and people were stuck at home, we didn't see as many folks, joining Project 10 Million by coming through what we call the consumer route, which is an individual coming and joining the program. But we're starting to see that happen more and more. But we're also still seeing just as many school districts coming to partner with T-Mobile in the second year of the program as we did in the first, and continuing to see, as I'm sure Angie can understand, as a kid from Idaho's West Central Mountains, I grew up in a town of 800. We work with a lot of the largest school districts in the country, but I think some of our next work is being able to figure out how to reach, the nation's 10,000 rural school districts, and helping them figure out how to be able to create sustainable connectivity plans. You may have an entire team of folks working where I am today. I have a meeting with the New York City Department of Education later this week. They've got an entire team that's focused on this issue. Whereas in a small town, you might have, a person whose part-time role it is to figure that out. And so we have some work to do, I think, at T-Mobile and probably a lot of ISPs that work at a national stage to figure out how to reach smaller towns and rural markets in a way that meets their needs. It isn't going to be the same way that we might work with a larger set of infrastructure in an urban area. So Project 10 Million is available at just tmobile.com/P10M, whether you're an individual parent out there or whether you're a school district leader who's looking to create connectivity. It's a free program. And so I left education to come to a large industry player to try to make that program happen. So I'm happy to have as many people hit that website and hit us up for connectivity as possible while that program is going on.
One thing that I'm noticing as a common thread between all of us is the need for partnerships and collaborations. And I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about that, particularly what partners are you all feeling are absent from the table who should really be taking more of an integral role to help learners across the country?
Okay, so I have a couple of thoughts here. I think first is we're all talking about partnerships, and partnerships are really important. I also think that we are all, as practitioners, still kind of like feeling one another out as we go through these partnership building exercises. Like, are we all gonna provide the information? Are we all gonna talk about the federal solution versus the state solution versus the local solution? And how are we all gonna work together to achieve, I think what we are working towards is the same goal, which is universal access, but we may have different perspectives on how the best route, like what is the best route for getting there. So for a company that it is driven by profit, and that's not a judgment or criticism, that's what a for-profit company is. A company is going to have a different perspective on that than an electric utility is. And so I think that when we're talking about folks at the table, it's about coming at it from and being open-minded and recognizing that there is no one single solution that is going to be right for every single community. That's part of the reason why we are in this scenario that we are in right now, is that there was an assumption that there was a one-size-fits-all solution for the entire nation. There's not when it comes to broadband. So when we are talking about the other partners that need to be at the table, just got ahead of myself there, but one of them is funders. We need the philanthropic community to participate in these conversations and to help support the work of folks who are on the ground. We need to have them support communities and the coalition building that's going on right now, as well as the research that's needed, the equipping of local leaders to meaningfully, one, get educated, to Jeff and Angie's very eloquent points that they've made throughout this panel, but to help them get educated and prepared to engage in these conversations. Because there is that question, I mean, your local mayor, your school board member, this isn't within their wheelhouse, but if I can learn it, they can learn it. So I think that there is the role of funders and helping to provide investment in the field for that training, capacity building, and that coalition building to really help equip local leaders to participate and capitalize on these opportunities that are available. I think also we do need to see more coordination between agencies. And I mean that between state agencies and then also between federal agencies. There are a lot of areas where broadband, digital equity devices, a lot of spaces where those are eligible uses of funds across many different programs. And the more that we can identify opportunities to coordinate and then streamline the use of those funds, the further the reach of those funds will go. So that requires a more complicated a more nuanced understanding of the network infrastructure of broadband, but also of some really complicated funding programs. We can help through education, but we do need to make sure that there is more coordination within state agencies and between federal agencies as well.
Yeah, I'll just add on that. When Heartland Forward, when we think about sort of what's next for us and how do we show up and really drive action on this specific issue, there's three things that I would say that we're focused on. It's support, it's workforce, and it's policy. And some of the conversations I know that, Opportunity Broadband is also having. So Kathryn alluded to it as the support. How do we connect all levels of government, and how do we ensure that they're talking to one another, and that it's okay? This is a nonpartisan issue. This is an issue to help our communities and to drive action. And so other stakeholders that we've talked about, we can help convene those individuals. States shouldn't be concerned that NTIA is hiring someone to be in their state. I'm hearing from some Heartland states of like, why would they bring a federal person to come in? And I'm like, no. This is to help ensure you get the dollars that you need. So we should embrace that, right? Like we should welcome them, roll out the red carpet. Like we have a list of things that they can do on day one. And so
with DOI.
Yeah. And so, how do we bring that together through stakeholders? Because the support of, just the government talking to each other is huge. And we could say that, sometimes through the beginning stages of all of this, especially during COVID, governor's office did play a leadership role. Well, how do we bring the legislators along? Because guess what? They're in those districts and they're running into their constituents when they're back home, and mayors, we know, like, you know where the mayor lives, your kids go to school with them, like all of those things. So how do we make sure that all those, policymakers are at the table together? And then folks like all of us, whether it be nonprofits or the industry, let's lend the expertise. Like we've done grant writing. We've the companies have done the data on some of the mapping and where there's service, but where they know they're hearing from their customer that we need to advance and do those things and what it's going to cost. So that's kind of the support piece. So how do we support, bring them together, and then, putting pen to paper on a lot of this stuff. So, we're going to help the state of, in the Heartland to write their digital equity plan and make sure that they're then connected to NTIA. So we've answered all the questions to do that. The second piece, I think it can't get lost, and this is another stakeholder to your specific question of who do we make sure that is at the table. I think K-12 definitely has showed up and is doing a great job, and you guys have talked about that through the work that you're doing specifically. But one thing, and we're talking with a lot of our Heartland states, specifically in the state of Arkansas, is how do we partner with community colleges and the local providers to, hey, once these federal dollars start coming to us in big ways, do we have the workforce to actually put the infrastructure in the ground and then build the IT and tech opportunities around that? Today, just in the state of Arkansas, like this minute, there's over 300 jobs that are available for the infrastructure side of things. I mean, we are in a labor crisis, name an industry and we're in a labor crisis, but if we're gonna make sure we get people connected, how do we work with community colleges, How do we create apprenticeship programs through, the K-12 system to start getting people trained up and ready for these jobs that are coming? These are great jobs too. You can live on the infrastructure side and very much go into the IT side of things. Like there's lots of mobility and great jobs that can happen. And as an organization that's focused on the Heartland, like we want people to stay in their states and in the Heartland communities to be able to drive that workforce. So I would say, bring in those community colleges, bring in those folks that are already running apprenticeships in other industries, and how do we make that happen? Because states, and we talked to a lot of broadband offices, like they're worried, like we're going to have to compete for this workforce. And what does that mean? If you compete for the workforce, like probably the cost of service eventually starts going up, right? And there's just not enough. So that workforce, I think, is so key. And then the last thing out of the support workforce, the last thing would be policy. And I mentioned that, if you're working in a state and your legislative representatives and senators at the state level have worked as closely on this issue, let's educate them. Let's tell them what needs to be done, but let's not delay things. Let's not, this is, again, nonpartisan. Competitiveness needs to happen among the industry, and let's not create additional barriers at the state level so communities have to wait that much longer. We need to modernize our policies, and we relaxed some policies around telehealth and other things during the pandemic, but those things need to stick so we can truly move forward.
Yeah, and I just had two different groups, I think, that haven't been mentioned so far, because I agree with everything that was already said. I think, so I started my career as a teacher. I'm very focused on K-12 at T-Mobile, but I also think that one group that we need to think about is retirees and folks who are later in life, particularly because, somebody mentioned earlier that, you can't really ask for people to sign up for internet using a web form. And you can't do that, particularly in an age group that doesn't necessarily believe that there is a lot that they will be able to gain from that connectivity. I can't find an 8-year-old in this country that doesn't understand and want more data usage for everything from video games to schooling to figuring out the latest XR thing to TikTok. But also they also know that their parents can get, can get telehealth and telebanking because that's like the world that they live in. It is the ocean they swim in. But for elderly folks, I think we've got a lot of work to do to be able to meet them where they are and provide connectivity in ways that actually will reach them. And so bringing in groups that can work with that larger and ever growing population group that's going to also need connectivity, that many times lives in houses that can be at the last mile in a lot of communities. They may have lived there for a very long time. And don't have the infrastructure even in their own home to be able to do that, and aren't sure where to start. And I think there's a lot of work that we need to do to be able to meet folks where they are and show kind of the benefits of connectivity so that there can be some trust built that when you're hiring folks from the federal government to come in, I think folks who have been around for a while have seen that maybe not work out sometimes and may have a higher barrier for trust that we need to work through. And then the other group is kind of civil society groups. So I think we've talked a lot about policymakers and elected officials. Industry needs to be at the table as well, of course. But my dad is a member of the Lions Club in his hometown and has been for forever. And decades ago, the Lions took on getting glasses, particularly for students, but for folks that couldn't see. And that was a need that needed to be met, and the Lions Club stepped up and did that. There are groups across the country that do things like that. And I think going forward, how do we engage existing groups and help them understand how they can help with connectivity? Last month, we partnered with the Boys and Girls Club of America. They're going to help distribute Project 10 Million devices and educate folks about the program in their clubs across the country. That's work that T-Mobile is never going to be as good at as the Boys and Girls Club, where there are people on the ground working with kids every single day, particularly in the hours where they may not be connected. And so instead of T-Mobile trying to do that job themselves, I think, finding people who are already able to meet the need and be able to provide that education. I think we're going to need to do some work around that too, and utilize people who are already doing great work and add connectivity to their plate instead of trying to create our own little niche and only letting certain people be able to be educated on that.
Yeah, just one thing that I'd like to add about a partnership that ITSE is really proud of is that we recently partnered with the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. And the purpose of it is that every public school teacher will have the opportunity to work with us on development and implementation of its digital learning plan, but also have access year-round to professional development resources so that they can actually utilize the tools in an emerging way to get students excited. So making sure that the workforce that we are educating knows how to use these tools and implement them correctly. We have about 10 minutes left, and I really want us to get to digital citizenship because we all know everything with citizenship requires practice. And I want us to talk a little bit about the 22nd century and what are the key digital skills that learners are going to need to have in order to ensure that students are well equipped to be the best selves when they're online or even in person. What skill gaps do you think that we need to address?
Well, I think, digital citizenship, it definitely, we've got to be talking about it every single day in our schools and our homes. So we're ensuring that it is the responsible use of technology. But we've got to be thinking ahead too, not just sort of what is out there today, but what is the future of technology? How do we want to use it as communities? I think this can be, and we're seeing a lot of organizations engage in this way. It truly can be a ground up sort of definition and work that can be done to, this is what is needed for our community. This is the responsible way to do it. Here's how we teach our children how to use it in a responsible way. So I think it, goes back to a lot of the things that we just talked about is, our community organizations and groups on the ground and our teachers, we got to listen to them. And that includes, the business and industry. I mean, we're in a spot like innovation is going to continue to happen. We can't hold that back. We got to listen and do it and make sure we design things that are going to keep people safe and but get them what they need so no one's left behind.
Yeah, I think we were talking earlier a little bit about how ISTE's work in helping focus on the do's instead of the don'ts. And I think we kind of need to get out of our students' ways in some of this work. When you go into a classroom, you are likely to find that any kind of technology is many times taken away from students, right? Because why? Because they could look up the answer, or they might work together to solve a problem. How dare they be resourceful or collaborate using the tools and resources that they may have available to them. And so I think we have to really rethink what that's going to look like, because if we are teaching kindergartners that they have to be on a typewriter, we know that our partners, in the device field are planning for a world where keyboards are not going to be part of how we work. And if you think about 17-year-olds and younger, most of them have never really needed in their lives to learn how to, get on the QWERTY keyboard, except for schooling. And so how do we not have schooling be a place where, it's almost like the cursive debate. Do we need to teach every single kid cursive or not? Well, yes, because our grandmother used to write checks and they looked very nice and we can read her letters. Is that really what students need? And so I think some of that work, not just, what does it mean to be able to own your digital identity and be able to make sure that you're taking care of yourselves and be able to respectfully dialogue with other folks, but we're pretty soon to a world where AI is going to be able to write the essay that a student is going to produce, or create the resume that an applicant may want, whether that applicant is being truthful in the resume that they are creating or not. Legal documentation is going to be able to be created for us without the need of lawyers and different things like that. And so what does that mean for technology, and how do we stop saying put that away for now because now we're actually going to learn, and bring technology into everything that we're trying to learn. And so I think, yes, we've got a lot of work to do to help students get a lot of those skills, but we have to, I think, reform a lot of the ways that we actually teach those skills, because it many times starts with putting the technology to the side, and we've actually got to live in a world where technology is going to be with us, and we have to stop saying whether we like it or not. We have to start saying, and we better like it because it's the way it's going to be, and not bring in that whether we like it or not thing, because that's not the world that students are going to be working and living and creating in the future.
I think that I think I'm repeating what Angie and Jeff have said in different ways, but we need to stop treating this as an otherness. That tech is sort of this thing that you learn as a nice to have. You do a Raspberry Pi, or you do like, oh, that's just those kids in that after school program, like they're doing that because that's just this thing that they're into. Like, no, it's something that's a skill set that we all should really be learning. And I actually learned really painfully through my last job before I came to the Pew Charitable Trust. Like, can't teach an old dog new tricks. Apparently you can learn how to use Raspberry Pi that's designed for kindergartners. But the point is that like, we need to stop treating technology as this thing, to Jeff's point, that you put it aside, or it's something that only certain industries or sectors or whomever uses. We all interface with this. And whether we are talking about digital skills as something as putting information in an input form, or being able to use a device to take an order at a restaurant, to something that is as advanced as, advanced coding and engineering and developing AI, there's a spectrum there. So we need to better serve our students, I think, by getting more specific about what those spectrum of skills are, how they relate to different career paths, and how those students can participate in those career paths. And then also helping our educators and our education system adapt to help pipeline those kids and those students into those paths as well. But I think the more that we can recognize and embrace that technology is not a bad thing, it is not an other thing, it is not something to treat as sort of an extracurricular activity. There we go. This is something that will be embedded in our daily lives, and we need to treat it that way and approach it that way with our education system, and also recognize too and teach the students through that process and their educators, boundaries of privacy and security, and here's how to protect yourself when you are using this technology. I think that is a really critical piece of all of this. We haven't talked about that at all today. But I think that that's somewhere too where policy in the field really needs to accelerate its efforts. And how do we make sure that we are creating safe spaces for students and teachers to educate and participate and use technology, and again in a safe and respectful way. But I think that as we need to stop treating tech as an other, and really embrace it for all of the assets that it can bring and how it can really enrich the student experience.
We've had a very robust discussion today, and we can all see the passion that we all have for this issue. I'd like for us to end to think about, what does success look like? We've talked a lot about, where the challenges are, where the barriers are, but what does success look like for each of us when we think about access and the need for speed?
I would go back to at Heartland Forward, one, we want to be a resource. This is an economic issue. So how do we support our policymakers, our communities? How do we engage and create the workforce of the future? And how do we ensure that we're modernizing policy and doing it in a way that helps our students and that helps our state and local leaders? I would just encourage, and I think Kathryn and both Jeff has said it, like, it's time, the time to act is now. So if you want to get engaged, you can contact Heartland Forward at heartlandforward.org, go to our programs page, look at Connecting the Heartland, and there's contact information. Like, we're ready to work with those that share that same mission. So it's going to take all of us. It's not a one size fits all approach, and we gotta do what's right for our families, our students, and our communities.
I'm going to have to go check out the website, Angie. I think the two things for me, one is that students and adults across the country would be able to use connectivity to either do things better than they were able to do them before, or discover new things that they didn't know how to do before, and that they'd have the connectivity and devices that they need to do that. And the second thing for me would be for T-Mobile to give out every single one of its Project 10 million devices and sets of service that we have committed to. So you can help us do that by going to tmobile.com/P10M and figuring out whether either at the individual level or the school district level, how we can help bring connectivity to your community.
Two pieces for us. First is that within 5 years, we really are starting to document where we are making that progress on that universal broadband access, where those programs are making that demonstrative impact on closing the digital divide. The second piece is that we're being able to start telling those stories about what impact that connectivity is having on communities. So that way we can surface, share, replicate, and keep that trend going across the country. So fingers crossed, that's what we're getting to.
Awesome. And I would just say for ITSE, it's really about implementation, providing the resources for educators to be able to implement successfully. I want to thank you all for your time today. It has been a wonderful discussion, and I'm looking forward to continuing the discussion beyond this forum. And again, thank you to the Ronald Reagan Institute.
Thank you.
Thank you.